Good evening and a very warm welcome to The Point. I'm Birgit and it's wonderful to be with you for the program this evening. Well, the topic on the program tonight is an important one, which is that of suffering. And from time to time we receive requests from viewers asking us to look at this topic of why it is that God allows suffering. And this is a very profound topic theologically, and it's also very sensitive pastorally. So it's with great care that we touch on this issue tonight, with a testimony and some reflections which we hope will offer hope and encouragement. And joining me to discuss this is evangelist and founder of Lumina Ministries, George Osborn. George, welcome to The Point.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you back because you've been with us a couple of times before.
Yes, yeah.
I just wonder, George, for people that may be coming across you for the first time, whether you'd be able to share a bit about yourself and about Lumina.
Sure. So I run a ministry called Lumina Ministries. So people will know that that word Lumina is the word for light. So it's taking the light of Christ into dark places, really. So try and reach out in lots of different settings, New Age shows and pubs, or lighthouse agency where I work in Woking in Surrey. So just any way we can try and reach out, really. So I run that ministry on a day-to-day basis. Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful, just to have a bit of an idea of your ministry background. And George, I know that you and your wife Kate have been through a very difficult experience this year, and you are very generously willing to share about that experience as it's relevant to suffering. So I wonder if you would share with us.
Yeah, sure. So my wife and I, we've been trying to have children for a number of years, probably coming up to about 4 years. So it's been a bit of a rocky road. So initially, for 2 years, we were trying to have children and weren't able to conceive. And then we just began to see the doctor about 2 years in to see if we could get some help. So our first fertility appointment, we discovered actually we were pregnant during that appointment. We didn't realise at the time. So that was a great breakthrough for us and an exciting time. So Kate was pregnant, went for our 12-week scan. And unfortunately, Kate had miscarried. So when we got to that 12-week scan, we found out that baby had just died, really, just a couple of weeks before that scan. And obviously, we were pretty heartbroken. I think part of the pain of that as well was we had to wait for a physical miscarriage to take place. So I remember meeting Kate from work a few days later. And unfortunately in that meeting she come home from work early, not feeling well, and she actually miscarried at the side of the road on the way back from home, and I had to sort of call her mum to come and pick us up. It was just a horrible scene, really, and a horrific time, actually. We ended up going to hospital because there was a lot of blood loss and complications. So that was the kind of first episode, and we picked ourselves up from that and began trying again. And God blessed us with another pregnancy a few months later, but unfortunately went through another miscarriage, and this was actually repeated 3 times. We had 3 miscarriages, and then the 4th time we got pregnant, we went through a slightly different avenue. So the doctors gave us different sort of medication to take during that pregnancy, and so there was a slightly different feel to that pregnancy compared to the other ones.
Right.
There was a lot of hope. Things were looking a lot more positive. And we got to our 12-week scan. And for the first time at a 12-week scan, we saw a heartbeat and the baby was well. And so it was exciting times. The family were beginning to get excited, and we were beginning to plan now for to have our own child. So it was really exciting time. And it was probably about 17 weeks in, there was a slight bleed, so it was panic stations again, but everything was all right, and we got the all clear again. And then 3 weeks later, Kate went for a routine sort of check-up appointment, and the doctor there said, we need to send you for an emergency scan, there's a complication. And it actually turned out that Kate's cervix was opening. So we were rushed upstairs to the ward there, and I was hoping there would be something we could do. I was looking at Dr. Google, trying to get some advice, and but unfortunately the consultant came in and said, look, this is not looking positive. We're going to have to keep you in bed, babies aren't viable until 24 weeks if they're delivered. So we were at about 20 weeks. So at that stage, there was still some hope. We thought that maybe we could get to 24 weeks. It would mean Kate was in bed for that time. But unfortunately, there were further complications. Kate got an infection. And it was touch and go for Kate, really, in terms of that infection. So we had to make the very difficult decision that if we treated Kate for this infection, it would mean that she would have to give birth to the child and the child would die. And I felt the real weight of that responsibility. Yeah. Kate wasn't well, so she was not able to make clear decisions. So I was kind of in that position of, I need to save my wife, but also want to save this child. And
what a devastating position to be in, to be faced with that decision. Kate being in this very difficult situation of having an infection present and suffering with that, and the doctors telling you the outcome of that, but also the welfare of your little one. And in the midst of having that background as well, it would have been the most unbelievably difficult time for you.
Very difficult. Yeah. I just remember phoning a friend and just, what do I do? What's the decision I make? And prayed, Jesus, take this away from us. And it was probably a couple of hours later. In many ways, God did take that decision away because Kate deteriorated quite dramatically. So it meant that we had to treat Kate urgently, which meant that the baby was going to die. So Kate was treated for the infection. And then a few hours later, she had to give birth to our baby, who we named Grace, but she was born a few weeks ago, but died, almost instantly. And yeah, it was horrific. And I know there's going to be people listening to the programme that are going to be in worse situations and different types of suffering. But this was our pain, and it was a hard time, and lots of why questions and what's happening, and all sorts going through our minds. But I remember even in that room, still praising God. In the middle of it, and I remember thinking, whether this is a revelation from God or not, but just thinking, wow, the pain that the father had to go through in seeing his son die. Yes. I'm getting a little taste, a small taste of seeing my own child die in order to see Kate survive. There's definite parallels there But I don't want to gloss over either the pain and the difficulty, and I think that got worse after the initial finding out and the initial having to go through this. Maybe sort of 2 or 3 weeks later was probably the more painful time. As
you had the chance to process what had happened.
Yeah, and think things through, and I guess begin to think, why has this happened? Seeing very healthy choice of wanting to have children, thinking, well, that's a biblical mandate. God said multiply, and God, we're trying, and we want that to happen. Other people having children and not really wanting them, and there's us wanting children. God, why wouldn't you give us a child? So lots of these questions going around our minds, and just the very real pain of it, actually.
I have so many questions, George, but just to start off by really thanking you so much for being willing to share about this experience, and just how sorry I am to hear about what you and your wife have been through, because it is it's incredible suffering to have that hope, and as you say, a God-given hope and desire for family, and for the blessing of that, and then going through this experience, and not just once but several times, and all of the turmoil that's involved in that, the emotional consequences, the loss, the grief, but also the physical trauma involved as well. It's quite horrendous. You touched on the blood loss and the pain that Kate would have been through, and even when you described the terrible position that you're in making that decision, and after the infection lessened in Kate, then having to go through the labour, and the strangeness of that situation, that generally there's the hope set before us with a little one coming, but in your situation it would have just compounded the absolute grief that you are in. So my heart truly goes out to you and your wife. And just to ask, before we continue on, how is Kate now? How are you both at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, there's been ups and downs. There's been good times and bad times through the last few weeks. I think physically Kate's recovered now, but she's got her good days and her bad days, but we're growing through it, and it's bringing us, I think one of the gifts that we've had through it's brought us closer together, trying to support one another through it. But I think certainly for Kate, it's a harder thing as well, because as you mentioned, the physical side of things. This is four miscarriages over 18 months. The turmoil on the body and hormones racing around. There's all sorts going on.
And the fear, I would imagine, because I remember reading an article that you've written about this, where you cited a statistic: 1% of couples have 3 miscarriages, but in your case, you've had 4. I mean, so there would be a very real fear about what lies ahead as well. So actually bringing that before God and seeing how God ministers in all of these different aspects of the suffering. So I wonder if I could start by asking you, because you just touched on that question of why, and I think that when we as Christians face any kind of pain, adversity, suffering, in whatever form it takes, it's a very natural question to ask. So as you ask God, how did God respond? How did God minister to you with that?
Well, I took some time out from work, took some time away, had a week or two off work, just trying to wrestle with that question, really. One of the things that I love doing is walking, and I spent days just walking, really, and praying. And I guess that question just kept going round and round in my mind. Why is this happening? Why wouldn't we be able to have children? And to be up front, I didn't get the answers. I don't know why. I don't know why we can't have children. I don't feel that God's given me those answers. But one of the things that's probably stuck with me these last weeks is not necessarily getting the answer to why, but getting who God is, getting more of who He is, and seeing Jesus perhaps more clearly in the suffering that He went through, that He was willing to enter into this world and to suffer with us. Has been a really powerful sort of healing in my own heart. I've spent some time looking through the book of Job. I think people often go there, don't they, when you are suffering. I've probably not been there much before that. But Job is a man that's got family, he's got wealth, he's got a good business, all this stuff going on, and literally in a day this is pretty much taken from him.
It's really interesting. You've made several quite powerful points in what you've just shared. The first with the question of why, and seeking God about that, and not receiving absolute clarity on that. And I think that's very helpful, and I think it's very real, because so much of the Christian life, particularly when it comes to pain, and we don't get that clear answer, we come to a place, I don't know if you've found this, of accepting mystery in our faith, that at times we don't receive the fullness of that revelation, and it enhances or gives us the opportunity to trust God even more deeply in the face of that mystery. So it's that point that you made, but also it's so helpful what you've said about how God gave you the grace to see that you were identifying more with Christ, actually understanding Christ in a deeper way through this. I think that's so powerful. Would you be able to share a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think the Jesus side has been amazing, to be honest with you. So just, I think the whole son thing, the father and the son, and seeing, I think particularly the father losing his son. So although he sent his son to die, the pain of having to let his son go through that suffering, I guess there's a fresh kind of revelation in that as well. And also just sharing in some way, and in some small way, I want to say, is Christ's suffering. Because of that pain and that suffering that we're going through, we do get a little bit of a taste of actually Christ has been through this road as well. So he walks through it with us. The famous Psalm 23. Even though we walk through that valley of the shadow of darkness, he will walk through us, and he understands that pain. He's not aloof or separate. He's not a God who doesn't understand what pain and suffering is. He's been through it.
I think it deepens our love for Jesus as well, in understanding that, even though it doesn't minimise the pain and the grief of suffering, actually seeing Jesus in that and coming to understand a fraction of what he endured, it actually, there's a possibility of our love for him, our devotion for him, growing in that. And a greater respect, exactly, for what he's been through. And if this is just a small taste and his is on a grander scale,
wow, you know, what sort of pain and suffering he went through for us, for the joy that was set before him of knowing you, knowing me, knowing the listeners, you know.
It's so true. And also what you mentioned in your answer about Job as well, and I think it's really helpful to spend some time on this, biblical examples of those who have faced suffering. Job is a key example, but one thing about that book that really strikes me is that sometimes we can gloss over the suffering that he went to. We can acknowledge it and say this is what he lost, but then in the end, God just restored everything. But actually, when you look at the length of that book and what he went through, what he had to grapple with, the friends, the counsellors that were with him, and how that impacted him, and then towards the end of the book, when he engages with the dialogue with God himself, and even talking about it, I'm sort of filled with this awe, because it's some of the most awesome passages in Scripture, in my opinion, where God says, "Gird yourself, you know, and stand before me, man. I'm gonna, you know, where were you when I?" And that revelation of God's utter sovereignty, it's in a sense, it's quite raw, because here's Job having been through what he has, but at the same time, the shift in perspective that comes even for us reading that, this is the God who created, and he goes into explicit detail about how he created this awesome God who is ultimately sovereign, which is, it's hard for us to accept that in times of pain. But would you be able to speak to that?
Well, I think one of the words that you said there was really important as well, is perspective.
Yeah. So
the perspective changes through the book of Job, I think, and certainly in my own journey with suffering, the perspective has shifted. So I think we start in the beginning of Job, and there is that kind of, you know, why is this happening? And Job says it himself, you know, is why was I born? I don't even want to be born. And I think you're right about his suffering. I mean, he lost everything, and then he received boils on his skin, and he wouldn't even touch them. They were so grotesque, you know. He went through just horrific suffering. But I think you've touched on it already, is he realises who God is, because God comes to him and doesn't answer and doesn't say, well, look, Job, this is why I'm doing it, and this is the sort of 4-point plan, and you'll get to this stage and this will happen. He just comes and reveals who he is and says, look, I am God. I'm not going to give you the why. You've got to trust me. And I think while we're talking about children, it is that picture, isn't it, of sometimes your parents tell you, you know, you're not going to have this thing, and why can't I have it? Why can't we scream and we kick and we want that thing we don't understand? But sometimes the parents just have to say, look, just trust me.
Yes.
Sometimes we get those answers late, and when we become adults and we think, oh, okay, that's why my parents didn't let me have that thing.
Yes.
And I think we will get that in the fullness of time. We will see in the new creation why these things have happened and what they've achieved. But at the moment, I think it's trust God, you know. We can trust he's good, we can see the cross, we can see what he's doing. Just hold on. And I think that's what he says to Job. He says, trust me, look how big I am, look how vast I am. I've got this universe in my hands. I've got you, I've not let you go. Trust me.
I think that's so helpful, and it ties into the way you described it before, that you moved from that questioning of why to the who. And I think that's such a helpful thing to kind of bear in mind when we're going through adversity, to actually, although it's natural and understandable to grapple with that question of why at a certain point, to move to that perspective of who and the sovereignty and the goodness of God. I wonder, George, if I could ask you about other passages from the Bible, because we were speaking about this before the program, and actually the way that the Bible is incredible for not shying away from the reality of human experience. It really conveys the rawness of human experience at times. And there are a couple of passages that you've highlighted. Lamentations is one, Psalm 88. I wonder if you could talk with us about those passages from the Bible.
So I think Lamentations 3 is a very powerful, and someone sent me a verse from this chapter when we were going through our suffering. So it was Lamentations chapter 3 verse 16. It says this: He has broken my teeth with gravel. He has trampled me in the dust. I have been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. So I say my splendour is gone, and all that I'd hoped for from the Lord. And obviously that those verses really spoke to us that, you know, all that we'd hoped for from the Lord had been gone, had been taken away. And I love you know, Lamentations, as you've mentioned, there's Psalm 88, there's Job, it's just the truthfulness of Scripture that sometimes there's pain. And this is written by Jeremiah, Lamentations, and he goes through a horrid time trying to reach people and trying to share God with people and getting ridiculed and beaten and having to go through all these different ordeals. And yet, you know, it's just written honestly here that he was filled with bitterness, you know, he had grief. But this chapter, I mean, even this chapter goes on with hope towards the end as well. You know, verse 31, it says, "For men are not cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to the children of men." So, you know, there's hope there as well, isn't there? That God is compassionate. We don't get the exact whys of what's going on here for Jeremiah, for me, for other people suffering. But we know that he's not doing it willingly. This isn't coming upon us because he's delighting in causing us pain.
Yes.
But he will use that pain, I believe. You know, he'll use that suffering in our lives to bring good. You know, Romans 8 talks of that, doesn't it? About how God will bring together good for those that love him.
It's true. It's almost holding on to those two aspects of who God is, his sovereignty, and allowing things which we frankly don't understand at times, but also his goodness. And even though that can be a very hard tension to maintain, incredibly difficult to maintain, that is what Scripture reveals, the sovereignty of God and the goodness of God, and that he is absolutely trustworthy, and that he is a good Father who loves us. And as you say, Romans 8:28, that he will use all things for the good of those who are the called according to his purpose. So there is absolutely that hope. George, in the remaining minutes, there are just some other practical questions that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. Firstly, with regard to pastors, leaders, other Christian friends, what would you say is the best way that Christian community can help people that are going through suffering?
Listening, I think, is probably the first thing that springs to mind. So, you know, in the book of Job, I think one of the highlights for the friends, they got it wrong sometimes, but the first thing they did, it says that they just sat with him for 8 days in silence. You know, they saw that he was suffering and just sat with him. So I guess the initial throes of suffering that people are going through, just to be there, just to listen, to offer help, practically. Don't know what that might look like in different situations, but cook a meal or, you know, give some money so people don't have to buy food, whatever it is, you know, just to help practically. I think Job's friends were a bit quick to offer advice, or that somehow Job had brought this on himself, and I think even today we can do that in Christian circles, saying, you know, did you pray about this situation? Did you, you know, implying that somehow this is our fault that this has happened to us? So I think be quick to listen and slow to speak, as it says in James, and just to pray with people, you know, to offer that prayer and that support, and to walk with people in the long haul. You know, this isn't going to be a quick fix that it's gone next week and it disappears. You know, people are going to be grieving for all sorts of things for months, weeks, you know, years, lifetimes. So just to walk with people as Jesus did.
Yeah, I'm reminded of that verse as you're speaking about bear each other's burdens, and actually there isn't necessarily a time limit to that. We're called as community brothers and sisters to walk alongside each other, and to give that kind of love that you're speaking about. And I think it's very powerful what you've said, that there is a time where just our presence alone, bringing the presence of Jesus through our own love, and not necessarily saying anything at all. Just being. Exactly,
just being there, just being able to listen.
Yes.
You know, and I think different people are going to suffer in different ways and deal with it in different ways, but I think just being available and also giving people space. Sometimes they won't want to talk, and talking about it's going to be difficult. So I think, you know, you're at a church service and you see someone that's obviously had a hard time in the last, bring it up, give people that opportunity to talk about it, but equally if they don't want to, give them that opportunity as well. But I think sometimes people shy away as well and withdraw from the suffering person. They don't, what do I say? Just bring it up and say, look, I know you're going through a tough time. If you want to talk about it, I'm here to listen. If you don't, that's fine. And just give that person the opportunity to choose and do what they want to do.
That's so helpful, and we have a couple of minutes left, George, but I wonder if we could conclude with you sharing about what you learnt of God's presence as you went through this time of suffering, the presence of God.
Yeah. I think it's back to what we were talking about a little bit at the beginning, you know, just knowing that God is with you in the middle of that suffering, that he is there, that he's not abandoned you, that he's not left you. And I guess it's going to the cross to see that God has suffered in your place. So he's not. This isn't punishment. There's no condemnation for George that I'm not having these children because I've done something wrong. God is right with me. Yeah.
George, thank you so much for coming onto the program and sharing about your experience, and also what you've learnt about God, his sovereignty, and his goodness and his presence when we go through a time of suffering. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
George will be with us next week when we talk about the topic of addiction. In the meantime, we hope the program has been an encouragement to you. We look forward to being with you at the same time next week. Goodbye and God bless.